And thus, my interest in this area of study, looking at teaching the Chinese class in school, looking at a pedagogical approach that's based on some of the concepts and frameworks from dynamical systems theory as well as ecological psychology. So this is a large project that involves 3 different phases of work. And therefore, I'm just going to share what we attempted to do and also some of these preliminary findings that we have. So conceptions about teaching and learning in PE have changed over the years. It has gone from a more teacher-centered approach to a more student-centered approach. Particularly, getting the students to develop problem-solving skills, critical thinking, autonomy of thought, and also to have students as active learners, and particularly also having the teachers to play the role of a facilitator in learning and teaching. And this shift in teaching and learning is also in line with some of the advances in model control and model learning literature, particularly seeing the learner or learning process as nonlinear, and particularly looking at the learner, how the learner behaves like a nonlinear system. So non-proportionality, so basically the idea of minute changes in the learner dynamics can lead to small or also big changes in the learner's behavior. Multi-stability, a single cause can have multiple behavioral effects. Parametric control, so consider changing specific parameters by the coach or by a practitioner can encourage the learner to explore different organizational states. Functional role of noise, again consider how variability can be useful and functional to help the learners to explore behaviors, goal-directed behaviors. So one student-centered model that has attracted a little bit more interest over the last 5 years or so is the idea of nonlinear pedagogy. So this approach provides a framework for design principles for physical education, and also gives some insights into some of these underlying processes in skill acquisition and game play. It's for researchers and practitioners to start to rethink how pedagogical practices can be enhanced to encourage perhaps more effective learning with PE. So background to nonlinear pedagogy it's underpinned by some of these ideas in dynamical systems theory and ecological psychology. And in recent years as well, a constraint-led approach, which Chris has mentioned earlier, has also given some idea about how we can understand the emergence of goal-directed behaviors. However, a constraint-led approach only describes but does not provide further explanations to help us understand the design principles that can underpin pedagogical approaches to allow such functional behaviors, some functional goal-directed behaviors to emerge. So this slide basically provides us with a conceptual visualization of what nonlinear pedagogy is. So you can see here, the learner is the focus, so it's student-centered, and we consider the interactions of the performer, the environment, and the task constraints, and how it impacts the learner. And consider also some of the design principles. So for example, representativeness. So the activities that we plan for, it should be situated, representative of the actual performance context. Consider how you can manipulate different constraints, especially task constraints like the rules, equipment, goal of the task, for example. Consider the need to establish clear, relevant information movement couplings in the learning activities, so therefore allowing the learners to establish affordances for functional movements to emerge. Consider also maybe the impact of different attentional focus instructions, be it an external or an internal, whether the focus is on the form of the movement or whether the focus is on the outcome of the movement. And of course, consider the role of functional variability, how you may infuse variability to encourage learners to explore and therefore acquire some of these goal-directed behaviors. Now this design principles collectively will impact how we may structure pedagogical channels. Pedagogical channels are the instructions, the practice, the feedback, such that learners can be encouraged to search for those goal-directed behaviors. So for this presentation, I want to just share some of the work that we've been trying to do in a school context. So some of the research questions that we are examining. So how is a non-linear pedagogical approach effective for learning a particular sports skill? So in this case, a modified tennis task in school. Can a non-linear pedagogical approach be applied to teaching small-sided games? But in this case, we're looking at a 1 versus 1 singles game in tennis. How effective is a non-linear pedagogical approach in a school setting for teaching game skills? As I mentioned in the first slide, there are 3 phases to this work, and those 3 research questions are packed to the 3 different phases of work. So the first phase is looking at learning a specific modified tennis task. The second one is a 1v1 game, and the third one is really having the teachers teach the lessons, the intervention in a school setting. So you can see the progression is more from a controlled environment and slowly to a more authentic context. That was what we tried to do. Now, phase 1, how is non-linear pedagogical approach effective for learning a sports skill? The focus is really on examining how the students in a school setting acquire forehand ground stroke. So we are looking at coordination and performance outcome changes. So students were required to hit to specific targets for tests and practice sessions. So you can see there are 12 female participants per intervention. So there was obviously a non-linear intervention group and also a very typical prescriptive traditional type of group that's exposed to the typical traditional way of teaching and learning. And we call it a linear group. The students, grade 4 students, were just around 10 years old. So the modified tennis task is a normal task for most of these girls. So 4 weeks of intervention. So what are some of these examples of how we went about the intervention? So this is an example of non-linear pedagogy intervention. So the focus is really on providing representative learning situations. So having them, to hit to different zones, being involved in a game setting, in the game itself, using different equipment, different size balls, different rackets as well, providing them with analogies of how to hit, so focus on the outcome itself, the trajectory of the ball flight. So the focus is really on allowing the students to acquire coordination and control in the task. And of course, we also try to manipulate the task constraints to help these students build effective information movement confidence. Now, I think most of us may be quite familiar with this kind of intervention, and this is the example of a linear pedagogy intervention. They're very prescriptive, like how you would hold a racket, how should your elbows move, what is the pre-execution, the backswing, the contact, how should you follow through. It's very typical. Right? I'm sure most of us will have some experience with this. So what are some of the preliminary results that we have found? So this is a plot that looks at the test sessions on the x-axis and performance score on the y-axis. So interestingly, we see that there is an improvement between post and pre-test for both groups. So, you could say then that between the 2 groups, between the 2 conditions, there are actually no difference, which could also mean that the non-linear pedagogy group is as good as the linear pedagogy group. When we are asked to hit to different targets, which is in some ways a form of transfer test, then you could see that again we see significant differences at the retention test section, and the non-linear pedagogy group is as good as the linear pedagogy group. How about changes in coordination, movement patterns? I think this is not something that's easy to do in a school setting, go into the school and capture coordination data. So we're going to show you a clip on what we actually did in the school. So this was an actual participant. So we had our camera system in the school, put the markers on the kids, have them hit a forehand ground stroke and capture the coordination data at pre, post, and retention test sessions. So very logistically very demanding. So this is another just a simple clip to show you some of these qualitative differences that you may be able to observe at the pre and post test sessions. So this is the pre for the non-linear. So very awkward, very rigid, and it's a scooping technique. See. Here you can see a little bit more side on, up the slope, a little bit more of a forehand, a bit of a spin in there. Now what about some of the predictions? So we looked at the use of cluster analysis to help us determine the different movement patterns that would emerge at the different test sessions. So maybe for some of the predictions for the non-linear intervention condition would be, you may expect a greater number of movement patterns because the instructions are less prescriptive. So you may think that then we may see a greater variety of different movement solutions. Whereas for the linear conditions, you may see a more standardized movement pattern because the instructions are very prescriptive to say, oh, you need to do this and that. Right. So this slide shows you the cluster distribution for the linear conditions. And based on the cluster validation techniques that we have, we actually see two main clusters of movement that was demonstrated by some of these students in the linear condition. How about the non-linear condition? So we actually see 5 different clusters of movement patterns for the non-linear. So again, this is some evidence to suggest that they do have different movement solutions, different ways of hitting the forehand ground stroke, and yet still be just as successful as the linear condition. And in addition, we also see some evidence where the same participant used different movement patterns at the post-test session. So perhaps some evidence of a bit more of an intra-individual variability. They trying different things during their post-test session and still find some success as well. Phase 2. Alright, can the non-linear pedagogical approach be applied to teaching a small silent game? As I mentioned, it's a 1v1 singles game. 7 weeks intervention. So this intervention occurred during the PE lesson. So again, very demanding, working in the schools, but principal was very supportive and we could do that. And again, we see the non-linear intervention, pedagogy intervention, some of the examples there. You could see the variation of the equipments that we use, allowing the learners to try different equipments. You could see here as well different variations in terms of the height of the net as well, just to challenge them differently, providing a lot of variability in there to help them explore the movement solutions. Again, representative, having them practice the game itself. And you could see this is probably again something that we're very probably familiar with, standard equipment, adult size, non-body scale, very drill-based. This is a typical setting that we see. So again, some preliminary results that we have. Looking at rally length, we see increases or improvement by post-test for both conditions. Again, we don't see differences between the two conditions, but again, you can argue that it is just as effective between linear and non-linear conditions. The number of successful trials being 4 or more rallies at least for the non-linear condition, actually it's a lot, it's higher or more than the linear condition you can see here, although it's not significantly different, but I think the increase is in the right direction. And we are also looking at the movement behavior. So we've actually installed a CCTV camera in the indoor sports hall in the school that allows us to capture a top-down view of the movement behaviors of the students involved in this 1v1 game. So we have it at the pre-test, the post-test, as well as the intention test session. So based on this data that we have, we hope to be able to look at gameplay pattern changes, maybe even looking at face relations or interpersonal coordination and how it changes from a pre-test to a post-test to an intention test. So these are just examples, but however, this is still work in progress, so we are looking at the data and maybe again some very interesting presentations in this conference has given me some idea of how to go about looking at this behavioral changes for this aspect. Yeah. So could see by post-test the rally was a little bit longer, coverage of space maybe could be better, or so that's something still in work in progress. On phase 3, we've actually just completed. So the question is really looking at how effective is nonlinear pedagogical approach in a school setting for teaching game skills. Now this is quite a difficult task because we have to go into the school and we had the teachers teach the lessons itself because we wanted it to be authentic, we wanted it to be representative. So we went into the schools, we worked with the PE teachers, and we helped them to develop the lessons together with us so that the different intervention lessons capture the criteria for either a linear or a non-linear intervention program. So that we had 2 teachers teaching this in this phase of work. Each teacher will teach a linear class and a non-linear class. Right? And 7 weeks of intervention, so again it occurs during their PE lesson itself, pre-test, post-test, retention, and transfer test. Now I want to show you a clip and I'm going to just challenge you to identify what you think is a linear section and what you think is a non-linear section. So this looks really systematic and organized. So teacher is right up in front there. You see all the students line up. Very organized. Very drill-based. Very coordinated. And this is the non-linear condition. You could see different equipment, zones, use of modified equipment, kids moving around, trying different things. Yeah. So a lot of student-centered engagement. Right. Okay. It seems a little bit chaotic. So, as I mentioned, we've just completed this phase of work. We are looking at some of the performance outcome data. We are also looking at the gameplay pattern changes like what we did for phase 2. So you can see how phase 2 begins to support what we are trying to do for phase 3. But we have also captured some qualitative data because I think we always focus on the students, but how about the teachers delivering the lessons? How do they feel about this kind of an intervention? And that was what we did. We actually interviewed the teachers and we wanted to find out what they think of their role here. So we have the T1 and T2, so that represents the 2 teachers there. And what is the learning process? What was the learning process of the children? And you could see one of the teachers say, it's a bit chaotic, the students, the child may not be able to see the flow of the lesson all the time. It's interesting. And another teacher said, look, yeah, but I think the concern here is the outcome. How do they hit the ball to the right area, the right trajectory? We are not so much focused on the movement form itself. I think maybe that's something interesting. So that was what one of the teachers said. Learning through exploration, and this is something that came out quite strongly in the interview as well, where the teachers felt that there is freedom for the students to explore different movement solutions, and how they even felt that students could come up with very unconventional, sometimes unpredictable ways of hitting the ball, but yet somehow still find success in the way they hit the ball. How about the linear pedagogical approach in terms of the learning process? Very systematic, very prescriptive, and they feel the need to tell the students to do exactly the way the lessons require them to do it. But they also felt quite interestingly that maybe the need for an optimal movement pattern across all participants may then end up leaving some of these individuals who may not be able to overcome some of their individual constraints to hit the way that is expected across all participants. So you could see some may don't really know what's going on, some may get left behind. How about enjoyment levels? Are there differences in enjoyment levels among children for both groups? The non-linear one, the teachers felt they can explore, it's learning through fun, play, exploration, they're enthusiastic because they're involved in the game. Because that's one of the key questions from students. When can we play the game? That's the key question. The linear one, less fun, trying to follow the instruction all the time. They feel the need to perfect the stroke, so the focus was on the movement form. How about how applicable is the nonlinear pedagogical approach in teaching and learning games in PE? I think some of the concerns that came out was, look, this may be tied to also the learner's characteristics. Some may feel that the freedom to explore is something that they are happy with. But maybe some students also want the teachers to tell them exactly what to do. They want to be spoon-fed. Right? Too much variability, it's one of the teachers felt maybe the buffet of equipment there. They are concerned maybe there's too much variability in there, whether it's therefore learners searching all different movement solutions or perhaps just one or two. Preparation time, interestingly, I actually found that the linear one is more demanding in terms of preparation time because they feel the need to remember key teaching cues that they need to give to the students, very prescriptive information. And because they expect the student to demonstrate a single optimal movement pattern, they would rather that they have a smaller group of students in there. Just a very quick summary then. This is still work in progress. We are looking at like I say, some of the remaining data set to tell us a little bit more. But at this point in time, I think the evidence is quite interesting to tell us, or to inform us of some of these underlying processes for students who are exposed to this kind of a pedagogical approach. So I think we are quite happy as a team to think that this is something that is student-centered, that allows exploratory learning. But I think it is the first step getting into the school to do an authentic investigation of this kind of impact pedagogical approach in the school setting itself, but certainly more. And this is definitely not just my work, and a lot of the data that's been collected by Miriam here, and these are the people involved in one way or another, big or small, to help this to be involved in this work. Thank you very much.
Okay, excellent presentation. We have time for maybe just one or two questions. You're over here. I think he was back first.
Thanks, actually, very nice talk. I'm actually quite happy to see that there's not that much difference in the video performance. The difference that you show in that they manage to be more relevant and have more fun and interacting with each other. That's very nice to see. And that's one of the major issues also that you see, because that's what the acting is about. But I also, it works in PE. I do agree with that. I'm quite sure it will work. But how about other domains? If you go like to older children or to more experienced people, or other domains, for instance, like learning to play music. I have a friend, he's living in my village, essentially, and he's a musician, and he adopts these ideas without him knowing it to teaching music. So what do you think about that?
I think it's tough. We talk about time demands. This kind of approach may demand a little bit more time, because in the school setting as well, it's always easier for the teacher to tell the students exactly what to do. It saves time, it gets to the point. But I think then we kind of discount the opportunity for the learners to then have the freedom to explore. But that takes time as well. And that's why for our work, we were actually a little bit concerned whether there was enough time for the learners in the nonlinear pedagogical approach to acquire or improve. And that was why it was in some ways quite heartwarming to know that there was the nonlinear pedagogy conditions the students could achieve the same or similar outcome performance as the linear. Because we would expect the exploratory learning, are we sure what they are doing, can they actually get there eventually? Again, some of the elite players in different sports, they feel that this kind of approach is time consuming, and you're not sure whether they'll get there eventually. Again, it depends on how you manipulate the constraints as well. Again, it's too much variability. If you manipulate the wrong constraints, you may have them search in different areas of the perceptual motor workspace, so it could be off tangent. So one of the key things when you want to apply this kind of pedagogical approach is that you yourself, the teacher, the instructor, must know your area very well. So you must manipulate the right constraints so that they search for the right solutions. So if you manipulate the wrong constraints, then it may deviate from the lesson objective or the task goal. So that will be the challenge.
Okay, as the last presenter, I'm going to move things along. I'm sorry. I'm sure there's lots of questions. I do encourage you to hunt down Jai and give him feedback and ask questions. But thank you to Jai, and
Thank you very much.
it's